Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we are going to be talking about political scandal at the highest levels of American government. I think there's an old adage, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And I think when we look at political corruption, patronage, the spoil system, and all this stuff throughout American history, it's true. The more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yeah, this is not breaking news for our listeners, but there is greed and corruption within the federal government.
No, really?
Yes, it's not breaking news. And it has to do with oil. That also is involved with greed and corruption. And, I think it's very timely that we're talking about a scandal today that does have some implications for the current oil crisis that we are experiencing here in America and basically all around the world. Right now, as we're recording this podcast, gas prices are still at a very astronomical level that hasn't been seen in years. And, a lot of people are saying, why does it have to be this way? How is it that we can't just, can't everybody just get along and gas be a certain price? And, why is it we're getting oil from this country and we can't use our own oil? And that's because there's a lot of political machinery that is going on that everybody's looking out for their best interest also. And sometimes looking out for a politician's best interest doesn't necessarily mean that it's looking after the citizen's best interest. And we see this in probably what was the biggest scandal. If we had to categorize scandals, maybe that's the way to do it. In today's society, people always remember Watergate. That was a huge scandal, right? Big scandal with Richard Nixon. Some people might even see some of the more recent presidents undergoing some pretty big things. The Monica Lewinsky, Bill Clinton scandal, Trump and his, I guess he's got quite a few that you could probably pick from. And even now with some of the things that the current president's experiencing, right? That, there's a lot of scandals, but the very first big one, would you say, is the one we're talking about today?
It's certainly the first major political scandal of the 20th century. And before Watergate, there was Teapot Dome. Before we got to Richard Nixon, there was Warren Harding and Albert Fall. You were talking about some of the scandals that plague modern presidencies. And oftentimes when you look at these scandals, it's things that the president, himself has done. Unfortunately, we haven't had a female president yet, but I think that's coming soon, hopefully. But it's usually something the president did or something somebody around the president did. And it reminds me, today we're going to be talking about Teapot Dome. It reminds me of a quote by President Warren Harding, who was, involved in the Teapot Dome scandal. And he tells a reporter the following, and I'm going to clean this up a little bit for our listeners. He says, quote, "My God, this is a hell of a job. I have no trouble with my enemies. I can take care of my enemies all right, but it's my friends. My friends, White, they're the ones that keep me up walking the floors at night," end quote. And I cleaned that up a little bit for our listeners, but it's sometimes the people presidents surround themselves with, whether it was Ulysses S. Grant in the 19th century or Warren Harding in the early 20th century or presidents today, sometimes it's the people they surround themselves with, in this case, Harding's cabinet, that gets them in some of the most trouble. And then, of course, the cover-up gets them into even more trouble. Warren Harding, of course, was a Republican. He comes to office, he's elected in the election of 1920, and he really runs on the promise of restoration to normal. By the time Warren Harding comes to office, we've had two, Chris, I think what we could safely say was politically active reform presidents. You had Theodore Roosevelt, Well, actually three. You had Theodore Roosevelt, you had Taft, but I guess Taft wasn't necessarily as outward with his reform. I mean, he still pushed reform, dollar diplomacy, things like that. And he also pushed some of the other domestic reforms that Roosevelt did, but maybe not as openly. And then, of course, you have Woodrow Wilson and the reforms he was putting in place. And after all of that, in World War I, Americans wanted a return to normality. They wanted just simply, let's just get back to life as normal. We've heard that a lot in recent years. Let's just get back. Can't we just get back to life as normal? And that's what Harding promises when he comes into the Republican nomination, when he comes into the White House. He promises a return to normal. But not only that, Chris, he also promises Republican leaders that he's going to defer to Congress, and that he's not going to be an activist president like Wilson and like Roosevelt. He's going to defer to Congress, and that's going to be something that he's going to regret. But it's the thing that he's going to regret the most, even though he doesn't live to see the scandal erupt really, is what happened at Teapot Dome.
Yeah, I think the other thing that we have to kind of keep in mind is that the backdrop to what's going on. As you mentioned, Warren Harding wasn't expected to be president. I mean, I don't think anybody expected him to. I mean, it just kind of dominoes fell because of who you knew and because of all the things. And I think some of the people that were high in power thought that Warren Harding would be a pawn for them. Yeah. They would be able to get things that they wanted to benefit them. Goes back to your comment about friends and things of that nature. And so that's how Warren Harding kind of finds himself in this place. But it's also, you know, we're talking about the World War I having ended. And so we've now experienced the Great War. And so war is now a very real reality with foreign nations. And so while that's going on, you also have the United States Navy, which is in the business of trying to convert their what was coal-fueled ships into oil-powered vessels. And to do that, they wanted to make sure that if another war was to come, that they had enough oil available, that they would be able to immediately fuel the ships, to be able to go out and to fight and do everything that was going on. And so under Taft, one of the things that they had done is they had set aside some federal land where they knew that there was oil, and they would keep those as federal emergency reserves. And an emergency reserve is exactly that. It is not something you use every day. It is in reserve only for emergency purposes. And so this oil, it is in the hands of the Navy. The government has given the Navy the opportunity to kind of hold on to that oil and use it as they see fit. But Ray, what really starts happening is when Harding does become the president, I guess the beginning of his downfall is he appoints someone, Senator Albert Fall from New Mexico. He appoints him to Secretary of the Interior. And the reason that he appoints him Secretary of Interior is because that's what Albert Fall wanted. And kind of, I'll pat you on the back, you pat me on the back. And so Albert Fall is now in charge of the Secretary of Interior. And Ray, by doing that, he does something that is really unheard of. He basically steals the oil directly from the United States Navy.
Yeah, the government, like you said, under Taft had set aside the oil at Teapot Dome there in Wyoming, had set this oil aside for use for the Navy, ships and stuff. And Fall, like you said, does become Secretary of Interior, and he actually convinces the government to move the control of this land, specifically Teapot Dome, Wyoming, to the Department of Interior. And when he gets that control, that's when he goes out to these companies, these oil companies, and he begins making really lucrative deals. And yeah, I read one person who said that, the deals themselves, one of them themselves weren't a problem because um, if he had done it right, if he had gone about it right, they went on and they didn't do bids, they didn't do anything like that. He just gave these companies the best deals they could get on getting access to this oil. And this one particular one, of course, at the Teapot Dome.
Yeah, and the thing to go along with that is we need to remember is that usually if you were going to do something like this, you would set out bids where you would allow people the opportunity to say, hey, I'll give you $1,000 to be able to have drilling rights at Teapot Dome. Well, hey, I'll give you 1,500. I'll give you 2,000. Whereas these companies are basically, kind of competing against one another. And he doesn't do that, and he basically, no public announcement, no bidding. And he just decides, I'm going to give it to the Mammoth Oil Company, which just happened to be run by his longtime friend, Harry Sinclair. And that's the issue, right? That's the secret negotiation. That's this, the scandal that's going to start to develop. Now, nobody knows it's going on, but he does, and he understands what's happening. And I think it's very shady what's going on. And what happens is he gets caught, and he just so happens going to get caught by newspapers.
Yeah, and it's interesting. There's two other sites out in California that he does the same thing with, and he gets in a deal with the Pan American Petroleum Company. It was owned by Edward Doney, another friend of his. But what's interesting is these companies also start, or these men in charge of these companies also start, in addition to just getting these lucrative deals, there's records of him of Albert Fall getting thousands of dollars from these companies. And even I think one company got him a ranch somewhere, this really nice ranch, and he was he was really personally benefiting from these deals, which of course you're not allowed to do. You weren't allowed to do back then, and you're not allowed to do now. That he was personally benefiting from all this stuff. Now the question is, Chris, what did Warren Harding know, and when did he know it? That's the real question that I think haunts the Harding administration, is how involved was he with this? I think it's probably fair to say he knew about the transfer to the Interior Department. He probably knew about the deals with Teapot Dome and these other companies, but did he know about the corruption that was going on with these deals? That's really the question. And Warren Harding, when we think about him, he wasn't exactly your poster child for moral behavior. Affairs. He actually has a child with a woman he's not married to. And as part of an affair. He's got a lot of moral shortfallings. So what did he know? There were other scandals in his administration as well. And that gets to his quote about, I can deal with my enemies. It's my friends that keep me up at night.
Well, and that's where I think you cannot remove him from this scandal, because President Harding had to have known what was going on, because his cabinet was known as the Ohio Gang, and they're known as the Ohio Gang because they're all good friends. They all have been together for a long time, and they all got Ohio roots, but they've also all have scandalous dealings. And as you mentioned, they're facing numerous accusations of corruption. There's influence peddling. A very interesting thing, maybe we could talk about this in another episode, but they were also being accused of selling confiscated liquor from government warehouses during Prohibition. Prohibition locked everything up. Harding handed the keys to a friend, and they're peddling the liquor outside of the government warehouses, no tax, no nothing like this. They've also got issues with the China in the White House. They like playing poker. There's all kinds of issues that are going on. So I think that he did know a lot about it. And the reason I think he knew a lot about it is because he asked his Commerce Secretary, who would be future President Herbert Hoover. And he asked him, they were on a trip, like a 4-day Alaska trip or something. And he asked Hoover, he said this, he said, if you knew of a great scandal in our administration, would you, for the good of the country and the party, expose it publicly, or would you bury it? And I think that gets to the crux of the Teapot Dome scandal, but also scandals in our society today that we experience. We hear the term whistleblower. You know, what, for the sake of the country, you need to keep this under wraps. For the sake of the, you know, a lot of times we hear executive privilege. That's a term that's been floated around a lot, especially recently, right? That for the good of the country, we can't talk about this. But Ray, you have to ask yourself, is it ever for the good of the country to bury something? Or is it for the good of the country that you just come up front and say, you know what, it happened, and we need to hold those responsible. We acknowledge we made a mistake. We're going to try to correct it. And that's a moral question, but it's also a political question that I don't think we've still really fully answered.
No, and I think you look at someone like Bill Clinton in the 1990s and the Monica Lewinsky affair. Wouldn't things have been a little different if he had just come out and said, yeah, you know, I had an affair with Monica Lewinsky, instead of handling it the way he did. But, you know, you're talking about Warren Harding and, you know, should I cover this up? Should I talk about it? He actually decides, I believe it's in 1923, to get out of Washington. There's I guess the heat is on now. So he decides to go to Alaska. And I've seen video of him in Alaska, and, you know, he's smiling. You wouldn't know he had a problem in the world. You know, he's smiling. He you know, he supposedly nails in the golden spike to finish this railroad. Really all he does, I say supposedly because if you look at the video, all he does is like tap it. And then somebody else has to go out there and actually do the work. But he's up there, you know, he's on his way home. He stops in San Francisco. This is, by now, it's August of 1923. He's not in good health. His doctor, I think, had actually told him, do not go on this trip, but he did it anyway. And on August 2, there in San Francisco in a hotel, he dies. And the next morning, and this is a wonderful story as well, maybe topic of a future podcast, is Calvin Coolidge in the middle of the night is inaugurated as president of the United States, not in some grand government building, not by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. His father, who is a notary public, and, you know, he becomes president like that. But once Calvin Coolidge becomes president, now he's been Warren Harding's vice president, and you may think, well, it would be in his advantage to cover all this up, to pull the blanket over it. No. He actually appoints 2 men, one a Republican, one a Democrat, in the Senate, I believe, to investigate these matters. And that's where this all sort of spills out in the open with these congressional investigations that go on, not just simply into Teapot Dome, but also into the properties out there in California.
Yeah, and then very quickly, you know, Albert falls on the hook. And remember, he's a senator. And so he's being investigated by his own people. And they find out that he's received a $100,000 interest-free loan from the Doane, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but the man you mentioned earlier, to purchase land for this enormous New Mexico ranch that Paul has. And what's interesting is that testimony later reveals that Doane, if that's his name, had actually got his son to deliver the cash to Paul, and they did it in a black bag. So, I mean, there's this like movie script where it's in $5,000, $20,000 stacks. It's in a black parcel bag. And Dad tells the boy, says, hey, what I want you to do is you and your buddy, y'all go and deliver this directly to Paul, which now put this man's son as part of this. And, Ray, just a side note to this, that Donnie will be acquitted of offering the bribe, because he'll say it was just a loan. He'll be acquitted of it. And, he'll kind of be free. There's no problem. But before he is acquitted, his son, the one who had the black bag that actually gave it to Albert Fall, just happened to be shot and killed. And it seems that the boy that went with the son to deliver the money to Paul was like a murder-suicide. Mm-hmm. And both of them thinking that they were about to get called in, that they were going to be arrested, they would get charged because they had the black bag of cash. So it's really a tragic thing, because the dad gets free, but he loses his son in the process because he had him actually participate in it.
Yeah, and it took place in this like palatial estate there in Beverly Hills, California, where the friend Hugh Plunkett. We're butchering names today, Chris. Hugh Plunkett shoots Ned Doheny, whatever his name is.
I'm sorry for that family. I've messed it up.
I'm so sorry. Shoots Ned, and then, of course, kills himself, fearing, of course, that maybe the law was getting ready to catch up with him, that what he had done was about to be exposed. And like you said, his father is acquitted of all charges, but then you have Harry Sinclair. Harry Sinclair was the guy at Teapot Dome, and he was the guy that Albert Fall had been working with. And he gets upset when Congress starts going after him and starts, digging into his personal affairs. And he basically says, look, you can't do this. This is my personal business. This is my personal property and all this. You don't have any authority to be snooping around in my business. So it ends up going to the United States Supreme Court in 1929 in Sinclair v. United States.
And that's a very important case that even kind of comes into today's society, because what we're starting to see is, a few years ago, there was this big discussion about whether an individual could, an individual in the government could request a president's tax returns, referring to, Donald Trump. The representative had asked the IRS to revise Trump's personal tax return. President Trump has said, look, that's mine. It's private. You can't have access to it. And so they used Sinclair versus the United States to basically say, hey, wait a second. A legislative body can't legislate wisely, can't legislate effectively if there's information that is absent. And therefore, we need to have access to that. And that's something that is extremely still relevant today, is what role does the legislature have in being able to access what some could consider private? Although, Ray, once you become a public government official, is anything really private in your life? I mean, isn't everything basically now up for scrutiny, up for reflection, recollection, whatever it might be, because you've chosen, and talking a government official, right? That you've now entered into the political arena, everything's going to come out in the wash somehow, some way.
Yeah, especially if you're suspected of having broken the law.
Right.
Harry Sinclair was definitely suspected of having broken the law. And he loses Sinclair v. United States. The Congress, like you said, basically says, the Supreme Court basically said Congress does have a right here. This is in the interest of Congress. Congress is investigating this matter, and you're at the heart of this matter. And therefore, Congress has the right to investigate what you're doing. Sinclair gets 6 months in jail for contempt of court, contempt of Congress, and jury tampering. Meanwhile, Albert Fall also goes to jail, but he ends up only serving 8 months, 10 months, something like that of his sentence, because he's not in good health anymore.
Well, he was convicted of accepting the bribe, and he had a fine of $100,000, and he was only sentenced to 1 year in prison. but because he had failing health, he got out. I think it was 8 months or so, and he basically. I just go back though, only a year, and now $100,000 back during that time is a lot of money, but still, that just seems to be kind of minor for what he actually did. I mean, he took the money. I mean, how much money did he make versus the fine that he received and the jail time that he got? I don't know. I guess maybe he got.
I believe he died not long after this. I mean, just a short period of time after getting out of jail. Albert Fall dies, and it's interesting that Albert Fall is the first cabinet member in the history of the United States to actually be prosecuted like this. This was a first, and it shows, I think, like you said, government officials cannot be above the law. Now, I think it was John Adams who once said, "We're a nation of laws and not men." So even a powerful government official like Albert Fall had to be held accountable to the law. And
the rule of law.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that the law is always above every single individual. It doesn't matter what. And we get that in the founding of our nation, as you mentioned with John Adams, but that's something that was talked about in British monarchy and over in Parliament, that, everybody has to be under something. And that one thing has got to be the law, because as soon as you start saying, well, this person's above the law because they're whatever, then they feel like Albert Fall. Well, I can do whatever the heck I want to do and I can get away with it. And then you just lose what the nation that you were trying to form actually is all about. So, Fall is put in prison. The Teapot Dome scandal does come to an end. However, there was still a messy ending to this, and that is that the courts had to basically come in and void all of these leases. They had to say, all right, it's no longer your property. We're going to give it back to the government. It is the government, and we're going to give it back to the government, and it's yours. But then, Ray, the government, years later, I think it was just recently, like in 2015, that the government sold the Teapot Dome, this time using bids and doing it legit, at least what we know. They sold it to a private company. And I believe that they sold it, for like $45 million. And the interesting thing to that is, when you look at our situation with oil reserves today, that was a place that was making 22 million barrels of oil. It's now in private hands. With all of the talk about oil reserves and why doesn't America just, develop its own oil for fuel and things of that nature, I wonder if that was the right decision. If you think about it, the government was receiving like $569 million.
Yep.
That was going to the government. So, I mean, that's just money that the government had. They could take less from me and they could just keep using that. So, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because there's a lot of oil reserves that are out here in our country. And there's a lot of disputes from environmentalists and from others as far as, is it proper to, there's oil off the coast of North Carolina, but there's a huge backlash about drilling into that. And so this is not something that is over with. We're going to continue to have these discussions. And I just wonder if the government, depending on who's president, depending on who's in charge, if there's not going to be this battle in which the government will say, yeah, just take it, let it be in private hands instead of government hands. And if that happens, does that help the cause of gas? Does that hurt the cause of gas? I don't know. I'll think about it every time I pay $4.65 for a gallon of gas. But we talk about that we're talking about privatization in all things of government these days, right? I mean, so you've got people that want, government to have all access to health care, where they pretty much dictate to you who your doctor is, where you go, things like that. And then you want a group of people who want it private. Get your hands off of it, right? You want the same thing with education. Some people are saying, stop, you want privatization, private schools. So our listeners and me and you, when we're talking about these things, this idea of privatization, whether it's the Teapot Dome scandal or whatever, it does impact us, and it does have implications and things for us to, we're not going to sit up every night and think, oh my gosh, what's the long-term effect from this? But the recent Supreme Court ruling about West Virginia and the EPA, as far as what the government can do to concerning, once again, that's dealing with energy. All of these decisions are still impacting our society, and you have a lot of hard-nosed environmentalists and a lot of hard-nosed do what's best for, individuals who cares about the environment. It's going to come to a head, and fuel is going to be right there in the middle of it. I just hope that there's people who are in government at that time that are not doing side deals, but are actually doing the right thing, the open thing, so that it can bring success.
Yeah, and I think Teapot Dome is a wonderful warning to private individuals and government officials who get involved in these deals to make sure you're on the up and up. You're not taking money under the table. Albert Fall and Warren Harding and everybody would have been far better off if they had just done it the right way and not, made backroom deals. Well, Chris, I think this has been an excellent episode. The case of Warren Harding and Teapot Dome and the corruption. I think one of the ideas I have for a title of this episode, Chris, is Corruption 101.
I encourage you to please go out there and tell your friends, tell your loved ones, tell your neighbor, tell the stranger on the street, hey, you've got to listen to this podcast. It's two history guys that just get together and talk about some interesting things about history and all other aspects. So find us on iTunes. You can find us on iHeart, Spotify, Sounder, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, you'll find us. And we hope that you will reach out through social media. Let us know what you think of the podcast. Give us any ideas, give us feedback. We can't wait to join you again for our next episode.